Okay. Can you hear me? Good. Good afternoon, and thanks for being here. I'm Dave McKee, and on behalf of the Kearney Bozeman Trail Association, welcome to our Veterans Day. At this time of year, we always pause to honor our servicemen and women who have faithfully served our country. To our veterans, our current military personnel, and to those who are not with us today because they made the ultimate sacrifice, we thank you. I mentioned we're with the Kearney Bozeman Trail Association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It was founded in 1985, and ever since then we've been providing support to the state historic site and doing programs. We currently have just about 400 members, and it's with their support that we can do these programs. So members, thank you so much for your support. We also fund the gift store up at the fort, and we publish the Lookout newsletter, which I have copies of over there. So if you're not a member and want more information, take a look at the table on your way out. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Sonny Reisch and Bob Wilson. I could probably go on for an hour about their accomplishments, but I'll try to keep it short. And I'll start by saying these two gentlemen combined have put in over half a century in managing Kearney, providing education, and doing preservation projects. So we're very honored to have them here. A little bit about each of them. Sheridan native Sonny Reisch attended Casper College and then the University of Wyoming, where he earned a degree in history. After 5 years as assistant superintendent at Trailland State Historic Site, Sonny moved to Fort Phil Kearney as the superintendent and set his offices up in the new building. For the next 25 years, Sonny would serve as first as superintendent and then later as historian, curator at Fort Phil Kearney. Besides management duties, Sonny worked with site planning as a tour guide and was involved in symposiums and special programs at the fort, Fetterman and Wagon Box, battlefield sites, and other locations. As a professional historian, Sonny has published numerous articles on the Bozeman Trail, the forts, and the Indian Wars. Bob Wilson began as assistant superintendent, historian, and curator at Fort Phil Kearney. During his tenure, he was able to acquire American battlefield protection grants so that archaeological research could be done at the battlefields. He provided art and composition for the initial interpretive signs and maps at the fort and battlefields. At some point, he and Sonny decided to trade places, and Bob became the site superintendent until his retirement. Bob is the commander of Kearney's Frontier Regulars. He is an expert on historic firearms and on the history of Fort Phil Kearney and the battlefield sites. As most of you know, he is a skilled artist whose dioramas and illustrations keep history alive for all of us. Bob serves as co-editor for the Outlook newsletter, and he's invaluable as an advisor to our Fort Phil Kearney Bozeman Trail Association. He continues to draw large crowds for his presentations at the fort and the battlefields each year. In summary, our association and our communities are indebted to Sonny and Bob for their support, their advice, and their commitment to history and historic preservation. And with that, would you please help me in welcoming Sonny and Bob.
Slide in here first, Bob. Okay. Well, thank you, Dave. Appreciate very much your comments. Seeing where all the years that went here. Sometimes I feel about as old as the fort. But anyway, just one thing I want to talk about is the uniform exhibits you see back here. And these are all the personal property of Bob Wilson. Bob has collected an amazing number of uniforms of various wars that the United States have been involved in. And so for this Veterans Day, he's doing his display of some of the major wars that the United States have been involved in, both the American and their combatants that they fought against. So take some time after the program to look at those. Don't touch them, they might fall over. They're pretty delicate in terms of the mannequins, but I'm sure Bob would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. He's quite a resource in terms of equipment and warfare, and I know he's got thousands of dollars into those, so again, I think it's a unique opportunity for you to see those. Well, we're going to talk today about the Civil War and the Bozeman Trail and the influences back and forth. This is kind of an overview. The Civil War and the Bozeman Trail are both deeply connected with each other. And a lot of the events that happened along the Bozeman Trail were as a result of what was happening back east in the Civil War. And in the post-Civil War period, which is when the Fort Phil Kearney era would be, there's a number of events, activities that took place, and also the intermeshing of the people involved, people along the Bozeman Trail, the Native Americans that were in this area, and then just the fact that the Civil War uniforms, supplies, the military style, were direct results of the Civil War, some of which transferred out here pretty well to the frontier, and a lot that did as far as military tactics. And Bob will be talking about some of the battles that took place and how the Civil War tactics, in a lot of cases, didn't translate very well into that. But the conflict during this period would be between the United States Army against the Confederacy back east and against Native Americans out here in this area when hostilities broke out during the Civil War. Things don't happen in a vacuum. And so in the Civil War, when the Civil War broke out, most of the regular Army units that had garrisoned and had held back the Indians in situations and had kept peace with the Indians or fought against them, went back east. A lot of the officers and many of the men were from the South, and they chose to go with the Confederacy, and others went with the Union. But basically, the regular army just disappeared from this area, and the soldiers from those old units went back east. And so there was a vacuum left here. More hostilities broke out between Native Americans and the local settlers and travelers and immigrants on the overland trails. One of the effects of the Civil War is a lot of people didn't want to be in the Civil War. And so they began to head east, or began to head west. And so you had people that came out here, went to the gold fields of Colorado, California, or after the Bozeman Trail was established in 1862 or 63, they would head up towards Montana and those gold fields up there. The United States government needed to have those gold fields exploited because it helped pay for the war. To have a hard species, gold was very much a necessity in terms of the economy of the times. And a lot of people, and one being probably John Bozeman, who the trail was named for, that basically didn't want to be part of it. John Bozeman was from Georgia, but he didn't end up in the Georgia infantry. He ended up out here, probably by choice, I would think. I don't think he wanted to be part of the events back there. As the Indians began to exert military power with the vacuum of the regulars leaving, the territories and the states such as California, Nebraska, or Iowa, Nebraska was still territory then, began to raise volunteer units to keep a pressure on the Indians and to fight against the Indian incursions that had taken place. And so we see the volunteer units becoming very much active here in this area. So again, because of this power vacuum, because of the raising of these volunteer units, and the Bozeman Trail would be very much a part of that. From the time that the first trains went up in the mid-1860s into 1865, when we would see the first real war and conflict along the Bozeman Trail, these volunteer units would play more and more of a part in it. Bob's going to talk a little bit now about Battle of Glorieta Pass, which is kind of the beginning of when the Civil War in the West, again, it's a part of the south of us, but it had a great influence because it would raise a gentleman named John Shivington to prominence. And that in turn would have a lot of influence in what happened up in this area. Bob, you want to use a microphone, or you want to talk on the microphone here? Get out of your way.
Well, as far as Glorieta Pass, it was in March of 1862, and it was sort of the first move by the Confederacy to go west and try to involve the goldfields helping the Confederacy instead of the Union. They formed up a Union unit up around Denver, and it was sent down to stop the intrusion by the Confederates. And they came together at a place called Glorieta Pass, which is in New Mexico. Shivington was a part of the cavalry. He wasn't an overall commander, he was just a cavalry commander. And I couldn't tell you the name of the overall commander. But during the main battle, they were proceeding along a river bottom at the pass. And today when you look at it, all the highways, the railroad, everything goes right through this real narrow pass. But on one side's a bit of a hill, and Shivington on his own went around and over that hill, and he was able to hit the Confederate supply train and destroy it, which basically stopped the battle and forced the Confederacy to retreat back towards Texas. And basically that was the only time that the Confederacy then tried to involve itself in the West. Now what it did do is it made Shivington real famous, because his cavalry move to destroy the supply train made him really famous in the West and also back east and amongst the military. And he was, of course, in his glory because he was so popular all of a sudden. And that led to his activities later in 1864 when he attacked the Indians down at Sand Creek and other things. During the short period that after the Battle of Glorieta Pass, when he was real famous, people were buying drinks and everything where he went, and he was real popular. But then his stars started fading on him, and he heard or found out about a move in 1860. It was going to happen in 65, and we'll cover that after a bit. But he wanted to kind of steal the glory on that campaign a little bit, and didn't want another unit coming in and stopping his fame, so to speak. So that's why part of the reason he went after Sand Creek and went after the Native Americans, to get his stars back up, get them nice and shiny and bright. The people of Denver, or the leadership in Denver, the military leadership, all of them had visited with Black Kettle, who was the leader of the village at Sand Creek. One military leader who's in charge of the fort down there near Sand Creek stopped Shivington when he was coming through on the way towards Sand Creek and told him it was a friendly tribe, they weren't warriors or anything. That night, Shivington put the fort under guard, so none of the soldiers and stuff could get out of the fort and alert the Indians that they were going to be attacked the next day. So you had the militia down in Colorado conflicting with the regular army. And there was a lot of confusion about who was really in charge. Connor was an overall commander, which we hear about the following year in the Connor expedition. But Shivington was what he felt in a different unit, so he didn't need to listen to Connor. He could do what he wanted. And he continued with the raid on Sand Creek, which really started the problems up in this country. It drew a lot of the northern plains Indians down into Colorado to support the Cheyenne down there. It caused a lot of raiding and attacking along the South Platte River, which just worked its way up to up into Wyoming along the North Platte River and along the Bozeman Trail, and caused several battles there in the following year. But that's kind of a quick overview of why Shivington's name became so famous in the West for massacring a village, I guess. But part of his purpose was not all that bad. I mean, what he did was horrible, but it wasn't like the Indians were not out terrifying Kansas, Colorado, several of the states right around Colorado, burning ranches, you know, kidnapping children and women. I mean, it was the Cheyenne dog soldiers out of Black Kettle's village that was doing a lot of that. And part of the reason that Shivington had such an easy job in overrunning the village was because all the warriors were out raiding. So they weren't totally innocent either. But that's kind of one of the main effects. There was no regular army influence out here to control all the different units and stuff. And they were going separate ways and doing separate things without a lot of guidance or leadership.
Corey there. Us old guys got to watch about everywhere we go up here. Anyways, Bob talked about, has anybody ever been down to the Sand Creek battle site? Oh, yeah. One person. Well, it's out in the middle of nowhere. It's way out in the plains of eastern Colorado, right on the border, the western border of Kansas there. But it's kind of an eerie place, as the Wounded Knee site is up here, is over in South Dakota. Because of that battle, the Indians then sent around, I guess you would call a declaration of war, which many of the tribes signed off, and Bob talked about. They started to raid along the Platte River and a lot of areas out here. And the Army, again in that fall of 1864 and into the winter 1864-65, were still locked in the death struggle back east with the Confederacy in the battles back there. And the Indians then realized after, well, that there would probably be repercussions for the attacks that they had taken in reprisal for the attack at Sand Creek. And many of the northern tribes and a lot of the southern branches of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Lakota headed up north and eventually up the north, beyond the North Platte, up into Powder River country, basically into where we are now, and to the east of where we are. And so you suddenly had a great influx of Indians up in this area as a result of Shivington's attack. So in many ways, the Civil War ties directly to the Indian Wars, in that because of Shivington, and because he had originally acquired his fame at Glorieta Pass, and then had basically massacred an Indian village. So what happened up here was tied quite closely to the events of the Civil War. And Shivington basically lost his power and influence. But through that winter of 64-65, the volunteer units, there were units from Kansas, California, Iowa, Missouri, New Mexico, Colorado, I mentioned it, that were fighting against the Indians, while the regular Army units were busy back to the east. Now, of course, in the spring of 1865, this all changes when the Civil War ends and the South is defeated. And then suddenly, the U.S. Army now is able to turn its attention back to the West and back to these situations with the Indians, and the fact that there were this large number of Indians. I'm going to use the word, although it's not a word that we use, not a very proper word, of the hostiles, but the hostile Indians that were up in the Powder River country. And the Army decided that they were going to strike back, and again, the Indians had attacked in the South Platte and the North Platte settlements in retaliation for Sand Creek, Now the Army was going to attack the Indians in the Powder River country in retaliation for the attacks that they had done on the Platte River. And what they had for an army at that time were these volunteer units. There were very few regular Army units organized that were going to be professional regular Army units, but there were a number of volunteer units, and so they gathered up a number of these volunteer units, put them under command of General Patrick Connor, who was from California, had been very successful in attack fighting against Shoshone Indians out in what's today the southwest Wyoming, southeast Utah. And so Connor, they created a new division for him and began to pull together units. And these units were pulled from everywhere. Just an idea of how desperate they were to get troops together to try to launch these attacks. They were under the wire in several things. One, these units were signed up for so many years and months, but most of them wanted to be mustered out. They signed up to fight the Confederacy. Well, there was no Confederacy now. How come I'm still in the Army? Well, it's because we decided we're going to keep you in the Army. And you owe us 6 months of service, so you're going out to the middle of a Dakota territory to fight Indians. For instance, the 6th Michigan Cavalry Brigade, who had been commanded by George Custer in the Army of the Potomac at the Battle of Gettysburg. The 6th Michigan had a great Civil War career in the East with the Army of the Potomac in Virginia. They marched in a grand parade in Washington in the spring of 1865. They were then taken, loaded on cars, many without their horses. About 600 were sent out to Missouri in preparation of being a cavalry unit attacking the Indians in the Powder River country. Then they had to get them horses. There's just a logistic nightmare with this, but you have to wonder how these guys would feel. They said, well, I've just fought 4 years in the Civil War, and now the South is defeated, and I get to go home. And suddenly you don't get to go home. You get to go west, young man. And so a number of them were sent out there. Connor also brought California troops, and they had this grand scheme of a two-pronged attack, one from the east, and one from Connor coming up from the south through what is today Wyoming, up into the Powder River country along from the Platte River. Another attack coming from the east over in essentially the Dakotas, and that they would trap the Indians in the Powder River country and defeat them and punish them and show them who was boss. Unfortunately, it didn't come together like that. They rigged these groups together. It's a constant mess trying to organize it. Getting supplies together, they had a terrible time just getting the supplies together, trying to get this operation going. And then by the time they did get enough troops together to pull off the operation, it was getting close to the time the soldiers were going to muster out. Connor figured he had estimated he'd need 20,000 soldiers to carry off and do a full attack. He got 2,000, barely 2,000, and most of them were, subpar units. They had to get horses for them. They were trying to make them mobile, trying to make cavalry out of them. And so they didn't get their attacks launched until that summer of 1865. And in that summer of 1865, finally, they launched an attack. Originally, just to show you how bad this was, the original plan was to have a General Sully, who was a pretty good Indian fighter, attack from Fort Pierre in South Dakota over into the Powder River, which is about 150 to 200 miles. Instead, they sent him off on some other mission, and they put together a column in Omaha. So they had to march 500 miles instead of 150. And, and it just created all kinds of terrible problems. But anyway, so these columns began their march in the early summer of 1865 in this grand expedition up into this area here. And at the same time, there was also what's called the Sawyer's wagon train or road survey expedition, which if you familiar, up by Dayton in that area, there's a monument to Sawyers up there. They had a battle with Indians there. So anyway, this grand expedition of kind of rigged together army took off. And thank God that our army learns from their mistakes on things like this. But anyway, so they took off on this. They finally got this expedition going in the spring of 1865 with General Connor leading the main column, and then this other column under Colonel Cole coming over from Omaha that way. And I'll let Bob kind of talk about the battle, and especially the major battle that will take place, which took place not very far to the north of here. Okay, Bob, let me get out of your way.
Why don't you just grab the stool?
Oh, that's all right. I would.
I want to see.
Yeah. I don't want to get too comfortable.
Anyway, the Connor expedition, Connor was basically operating out of Fort Laramie. And he had 2 units, or, well, 1 major unit coming out of Omaha. It went up the east side of the Black Hills. And another unit came out of Fort Laramie called the Sawyer group, and he went up the west side of the Black Hills. Then you had the group that Connor led, and they basically went up the Bozeman Trail. Then you had another group further to the west, which was apparently very small. You never hear about it, but it kind of went up through mid-Wyoming, I guess, up towards the Yellowstone River. It never really got involved in anything. Their idea was to come up here and attack the Indians along the Powder River or the Bighorn River, that kind of thing. Earlier in the summer, you had 2 attacks by the natives around Casper. You had the Platte Bridge fight, which is the bridge in Casper, Wyoming, the first one. And you also had the Red Buttes fight, which was up the river a few miles. In the Red Buttes battle, all the men were killed. Around 27 or so.
About, yeah, 25, 26, 26, somewhere in there.
They never really determined where the battlefield was actually at, but it was Sioux and Cheyenne that attacked. That's where Casper Collins was killed. He was on a real wild white horse, and he was very friendly with the Sioux. And they had made the statement after the battle, had the horse, because when the horse went into the battle, it ran away with Casper on him and took him right into the Cheyenne Indians who killed him. And the Sioux said, had the horse brought him to us, he would have lived through the battle. We could have caught the horse for him, and they were pretty friendly with Casper, so they wouldn't have killed him. Later, they see the Indians, some of the soldiers at the fort see the Indians leading the white horse away. And he's just dragging people all over the place. And they talk about that horse through their history. It never amounted to anything except hurting people. It was wild the whole life. Nobody could ever ride it, that kind of thing. But anyway, those 2 battles occurred as Connor's getting prepared down in Fort Laramie. One of his units, one of his militias from back east, kind of mutinied down there, and he had to take his California artillery group that was down there and have them point their guns at the infantry group to get them to come to order and listen to the commands. But anyway, Connor heads up this way, comes right through this area, probably camped along the creek here, went over the ridge up here. From up on the ridge, they had Jim Bridger as kind of a scout for him. And he saw smoke up in the Ranchester area. And so they didn't know what it was. In fact, most of the military could not see the smoke. Bridger could, but and the other Indian scouts could see it, but the military couldn't even see it with their binoculars. So, but they did send a scouting unit up there to see what it was. And they continued up towards the Tongue River. And they probably got up around to where Decker Cole is today, when the scouts came back and said it's a Arapaho village up there. So they sent a couple of hundred cavalrymen back down the Tongue River to the village and attacked the village. Up until then, the Arapaho hadn't really been at odds with the American Army or the Americans. They just kind of minded their own business. They didn't fight any of the other tribes. They were a fairly small tribe. But after that battle, the Arapaho joined the coalition of Sioux and Cheyenne, and were involved in everything from there on. Sawyer and Cole, after getting around the Black Hills, joined back together. They did not have any kind of scout or anybody with them that knew anything about the land that they were in. Nobody with the group had ever been out there. It's kind of surprising to me, but and they had about 1,000 head of horses. The problem was the horses weren't getting fed properly, and they were pushing them pretty hard. So when they got north of the Black Hills, they headed up the Powder River roughly into Montana, and stopped for a night and put their horses on picket lines. Next morning, 400 dead horses tied to the picket line. They lost about half of their transportation in one night. Probably what was going on was, well, they'd been working these horses so hard and not letting them graze. They didn't get their normal calories or whatever from the grass out here. I never quite figured out what the problem was. But horses from the east, when they were brought directly out here in those days, could not survive on the grass and what is around here. They were used to getting like 12 gallons of grain a day, which to us is absurd, but that's what the horses were used to. And without getting that grain, and with not getting hardly any time to graze to make up for it, the horses were losing weight, losing their strength. So, and that night it snowed and the temperatures dropped dramatically. So you had a bunch of sweaty horses who were in bad shape anyhow, and you took them and tied them on a picket line on the middle of a storming blizzard night, and it killed them. At that point, they had not heard anything from Connor. Connor was supposed to keep sending, because he was kind of over on the Tongue River at the same time, and he was supposed to try to communicate with Sawyer, and he wasn't doing it. So Sawyer's group, or not Sawyer, Cole Walker's group, gathered their stuff together, took their 400 horses that were left or so, and headed south. We didn't know what to do. The soldiers were starting to starve. The horses were already dropping dead. They couldn't ride the horses. The horses were too weak. So they headed back south down the Powder River. And lucky for them, Connor did finally send somebody over to find out what they were doing. And it was a sergeant. He got the Medal of Honor, I believe, out of this. But he got over to where Cole and Walker were, and Connor had started a fort down where Fort Reno is today. And the scout led the rest of Connor's expedition down to what was Fort Connor at that time, became Fort Reno. And they managed to have enough supplies and stuff for the unit to get itself back together and go home, so to speak. Connor, in the meantime, had attacked a friendly village, and by the time he got up on the Tongue River, roughly at the same time that Cole and Walker were in the Black Hills too, same time the horses died, he got orders to get back to Laramie. So he was brought back to Laramie, and he was eventually discharged from the planes. Anyway, he was reprimanded for the way he ran this group. I'm still kind of amazed that they sent Cole and Walker up into the Black Hills and with no scouts or nobody familiar with the country, and then to lose all their horses and stuff. But that was the 1865 campaign, and the military had stopped all traffic on the Bozeman Trail during that campaign. And they were also planning the following summer to come back to the Bozeman Trail and start putting up forts and that kind of thing. Up until 65, people had been traveling the trail, but they weren't having that much of a problem with the natives. In 63, the first wagon train was turned back by a large group of warriors. In 64, the Sonny Mission had several wagon trains go through, except for the Townsend. I'm not sure why they got into the fight, but most of the time the Indians would stop the wagon train and want supplies. They were kind of charging them a tariff to travel the road, travel through their country. And we're asking for flour, sugar, bacon. They always wanted ammunition and liquor too, but they never got that part. But so it wasn't until the military came back in '65 and then again in '66 that really started the problems on the Bozeman Trail.
Well, we're wending our way toward Fort Phil Kearney. We're going to start building pretty soon. As Bob talked about, you know, with that Connor expedition, with those events that led up to it, those volunteer units that came out here, and he mentioned Casper Collins. Casper Collins was a lieutenant in the 11th Ohio Cavalry, and his father was the colonel of the 11th Ohio Cavalry. His father is the one that Fort Collins is named for in Colorado. And so Casper in the 11th Ohio spent most of their time patrolling along the old Oregon Trail and along the everywhere from Nebraska all the way over to Fort Bridger. And they petitioned time and time again, we want to go east. We want to fight Confederates. We didn't sign up to run around out here in the plains of, you know, of the West. Well, they never got to, and then as Bob was saying, Casper Collins got killed at the Battle of Platte Bridge Station. But the 11th Ohio, and when Connor came up here and he attacked that Arapaho village up here on August 29th, 1865, he had some of the 11th, he had a hodgepodge of troops with him. He had some of the 11th Ohio, some of the 7th Illinois, and I think he had some of the 2nd California, which are his troops. So you know, they had a lot of various troops here. And the Sawyer expedition that come through here, they had left from down by off of the Oregon Trail through Niobrara, and that area came up to in eastern Wyoming. They were guarded by a couple of companies of what they called galvanized Yankees. And these were Confederate soldiers that had been in prisoner of war camps. The Union offered them the situation that if you would go west, we won't make you fight against your Southern, your Confederate brothers, but if you'll sign up, we will send you west to fight Indians. And they say, well, anything beats sitting around this prisoner of war camp, sure. Now, I'm sure they really thought it, because by the time they got them signed up and got them out of the prisoner of war camp, the war ended. But guess what? Their term of service didn't end, so they got sent out here. So the 5th U.S. Volunteer Infantry, which is a group of these galvanized Yankees, Confederate soldiers, ended up guarding Sawyer's fight, column partway. And then when Connor pulled back from this area, as Bob was talking about, and went back to Fort Laramie, where he was discharged, and many of his volunteer troops started to get discharged, they left this volunteer, the 5th Infantry Volunteer Company at Fort Reno, or which was then called Fort Connor, down on the banks of the beautiful Powder River. And if you've ever been to Fort Reno, there's not much out there. And I do have one letter from one Confederate soldier that had joined this group of galvanized Yankees. And he was from Fredericksburg, Virginia. He got captured in Georgia in a Confederate artillery unit, joined the galvanized Yankees, and came out here and was taking care of the cannons at Fort Connor. But he wrote this letter about what a desolate place this was and how eager they all were to get out of there. And then they would get out of there in the next part of what we're talking about here when Fort Phil Kearney was established. But again, these volunteer units, this thing had been just rigged together totally. So in the fall of 1865 and going into the spring of 1866, another policy was decided upon. And that was they're going to do another treaty with the Indians. There had been a treaty of 1851, and now they're going to do what's called the Treaty of 1866. and they're going to have all these Indians come into Fort Laramie and down in Southern Plains in another treaty, and sign this treaty, try to reestablish peace again. And then they also decided that they would begin to replace all these volunteer units with regular Army troops. So what they did was they took, there were three major regular Army units that would end up out here in the West. There's the 18th Infantry, the 16th Infantry, or the 17th, 18th, and 19th Infantry, which is called the Regular Brigade. The 18th Infantry was commanded by a gentleman that you're probably pretty familiar with, and that would be Henry Carrington. And these men had been through hell in the Civil War. They had fought through many battles. At the Battle of Stones River in end of 1862, beginning 1863, they lost almost 28% of their unit in this one battle. And it was the battle where a young lieutenant named William J. Fetterman, that's where he got his first combat experience. But this unit had fought all the way through Georgia, through the battles of Atlanta, and they were shot up pretty darn bad. But the decision that the Army made, they passed what's called the Army Reorganization Act of 1866, and each of these regular units, there are 3 battalions, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Battalion. They're going to take each battalion and make it its own independent regiment, and then build a whole new regiment of troops that would be stationed out here in the West. So the 18th Infantry, and Henry Carrington had not served in the field with the 18th Infantry during the Civil War. He had worked as an administrator and a spy chaser in counterintelligence in Indiana and Ohio, and he was very efficient against fighting what's called Copperheads, which were Confederate sympathizers in Indiana. But he had organized that regiment, he wanted to command it, he never got to command in the field, and then suddenly he appears, and here's all these officers that had been, through 3, 4, almost 4 years of warfare in the 18th Infantry, and Carrington shows up as a full colonel, and everybody else that had fought quite heavily were all lieutenants and captains, and they're wondering, well, who is this guy? He's showing up and he's going to command us now, and he had no military experience. I mean, he had no combat experience, but he was chosen. He had like great political influence, but he was selected would continue to lead the 18th Infantry. Now it was set up that after the beginning of 1867, he would keep command of the 1st Battalion. That would become remain the 18th Infantry. And then the 2nd Battalion, which is a battalion that was here at Fort Phil Kearney in 1866, would become the 27th Infantry. And then the 3rd Battalion, which is stationed over by Fort Bridger and into Utah, Camp Douglas by Salt Lake City, would become the 36th Infantry, if that isn't confusing enough. But, so anyway, but first they marched them all out here. So he gathers up all 3 battalions, and they eventually get together, and so several hundred, almost 1,000 men. They march from Fort Kearney, Nebraska, all the way to Fort Laramie, and then the 3rd Battalion goes over to Fort Bridger in that area, and the 1st Battalion goes into garrison duty along the Oregon Trail and the telegraph lines in that area, and also doing duty on the soon-to-be expanding railroad lines coming out of Kansas. And the 2nd Battalion, Carrington takes command of, and they march up here, and they relieve the Confederate troops, those galvanized Yankees we talked about, the last of the Civil War Confederates, still in active duty. They relieved them of duty at Fort Reno, which, renamed Fort Connor. It had been Fort Connor. They renamed it Fort Reno. Those Confederates were allowed to go back and get discharged back in. They could discharge them out of Omaha, and then so Carrington manned Fort Reno, came up here in July of 1866, and built Fort Phil Kearney. And then in August of 1866, a detachment of a couple of companies went up and built Fort C.F. Smith up by close to Hardin, Montana today. But the thing to think about in terms of the relationship to the Civil War and to the Bozeman Trail and Fort Phil Kearney is that 18th Infantry, as I mentioned, it was a shot-up unit. A lot of the officers had been terribly wounded. They had high casualties. They lost a number of enlisted men and officers to combat and to sickness. Then they also, Lieutenant Adair, who was here and would work as the adjutant for Carrington, he had with mini balls. They're big lead balls that they shot back then. He had one lodged in the back of his neck, and they couldn't operate on it. And for some reason, he had headaches. And eventually, he resigned from the service because of his relation to that. Captain James Powell, who would be the commander of the troops at the wagon box fight in August of 1862, he had too many balls lodged in his body. Now, I don't know, I've heard several, I don't know, those of you who might be in the medical profession might know more about than I do. I think that having almost 1,000 grains of lead in your body would have to affect you somehow, whether by, poisoning or whatever, but it's, I've had people say, it just kind of encapsulates and doesn't hurt you any. Well, he had two of them that they couldn't operate on in his body. And Captain Tenor Kearney, who was the commander of the post, who Carrington made the commander of Fort Phil Kearney here, he had spent several months in Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. And I used to think that Libby Prison was like a kind of just officers there. And I thought it was kind of a country club. It wasn't any country club. It was a horrible, disease-ridden place. And it basically broke Kearney's health. His intestines were shot, his nerves were shot. And so, so that's just examples of what these soldiers had went through. All the officers pretty much had been through the Civil War, one way or another. George Grumman hadn't been in the 18th Infantry, but he had been in 14 Michigan and fought, and he would eventually be with Fetterman at the Fetterman battle. But they'd all had combat experience. Most of the non-coms, the sergeants and the corporals, they had some military experience. And, well, I don't know, there's dispute about how much the enlisted men were. Lieutenant Wands, in his testimony for the Federal fight, says that 75% of the men were raw recruits. And they were on-the-job training. And this was not the place for on-the-job training, to say the least. But anyway, and others have said, well, there were more than that, and there were some that had served in other military units maybe, and so they had military experience. But we, it's still some debate, still exploring of how many of these men actually had, combat or military experience before they came here. So we see that again, that Civil War connection of all these officers and then the 18th Infantry. They were a unit that had been spent during the Civil War, and they sent them out here and sent infantry out to fight against mounted Indians. So you see the problem that they had right here. The 2nd U.S. Cavalry had also been a Civil War unit and had been stationed back east during the Civil War. When they got to Fort Laramie, they were not the same group of soldiers that had fought during the Civil War. They were mostly young raw recruits. Lieutenant Bingham had been in the 2nd Minnesota fighting against the Santee Sioux in 1862 during the war, but the commander at Fort Laramie described the 2nd Cavalry as the worst cavalry he'd ever seen. And so these are not the prime crack units that they were sent up here to Fort Phil Kearney. And it took a long time to finally get things reorganized and get these men reshaped. Unfortunately, Carrington, because of his lack of combat experience, he was a great organizer, but he didn't have the respect of his troops, or of his officers, which hurt him. And he also didn't have the combat experience, which probably also hurt him. Although, Bob's going to talk a little bit about, he's the expert in the uniforms and talk about the weaponry and the combat techniques that they used during the Civil War that may or may not have applied against the Indians out here. As you can see, that the Civil War had not prepared the 18th Infantry, a veteran unit, no doubt about it. But this, what had happened, their Civil War experience had not prepared them for what they found when they got to Fort Phil Kearney. Okay, Bob, get out of your way.
Where am I going?
Oh.
I'll mention a couple of things. Jump back to Fort Connor, Fort Reno. When Connor left the fort and had him start building it, he left it in the hands of the 5th Cavalry. He told them to start building it. Well, when Sawyer came through with the 5th Infantry, which was galvanized Yankees, they figured the cavalry were going to be better up the road with Carrington and with Sawyer than the infantry were. So they turned the construction of the fort over to the 5th Infantry, who were the galvanized Yankees. And they continued building the fort. When Carrington arrives at the fort has 4 cannons sitting there, but Carrington hasn't a clue how to use it. Now, there was a Confederate artillery colonel there. Sergeant?
Yeah.
That did the training?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Anyway, he volunteered to go north with Carrington, and he trained artillery units up here for men from the enlisted group. And so that's how they ended up getting some useful artillery up here. And the artillery does play a major role here. Almost every battle and conflict has the artillery involved in it somehow. So that was a pretty important asset to run across. He was also given 200 head of horses so he could mount at least part of his infantry, at least when he first got here. And Carrington makes pretty much the same comment about the 2nd Cav when they arrive as, who's the guy you...
Palmer, yeah, for the commander of Fort Laramie.
Yeah. When they arrived here, he said it looked like a company of bandits. Nobody was in uniform. They just were doing whatever they wanted. There was no military manner to them or anything. And when they arrived here, they were carrying what was called a star carbine, which was a single-shot carbine. It had been rebuilt so it could fire cartridge ammunition, similar to what they did with the trapdoor rifles. But it was a single shot. And after the Battle of December 6th, the officers went to Carrington and wanted, the band had Spencer carbines, and they wanted those issued to the cavalry, and that's what happened. And that's what the cavalry took into the Fetterman fight and gave away to the Indians eventually. But that was just some of the problems that were occurring out here. What else did you do? What else were you wanting me to?
Oh, just about the weaponry, like the Springfield,
Okay.
the fact that the single shot musket as opposed to the Spencer and to the...
Well, I'll touch a little bit back here on the figures. The figures back here are showing U.S. troops and their enemies, I guess, during the different little civil wars that the U.S. got involved in. So the first two are American Revolutionary and a British soldier. And then next you have the Civil War, and you have a Union and Confederate. And then you have the Spanish-American War, where you have just an infantry soldier and a Filipino. The reason you have a Filipino is because most of Wyoming's National Guard during the Spanish-American War was sent to the Philippines and not to Cuba. And they fought over there quite a bit. And then you have the Korean War, in which the Chinese and the Americans came in on either side. And so we have an American and a red Chinese soldier. And then we've got two Vietnamese. One of the Vietnamese, the one in the all-green uniform back there, is a North Vietnamese Army. And the shorter guy in the black up here is Viet Cong. And then with Viet Cong, you have a Marine. And with the NVA, you have regular Army. So that'll give you a little bit of an idea of what you're looking at. And like they mentioned, I'll be hanging around, so if you have questions or whatever, just holler at me about those. Out here, they ended up with 3 mountain howitzers and a field howitzer. The first casualty of the Fetterman fight was really from the field howitzer at the fort, and it dismounted an Indian right down in this area. There was a group of Indians scouting the fort the morning of the Fetterman fights, and Kearney saw them and fired on them. The wagon box fight was ended with a piece of artillery firing at the Indians. There was a Sawyer or Shirley fight in which there's some suspect that they think the Indians were trying to capture one of the mountain howitzers. And during that little battle, when it first started, one of the wagons was unattended. It was the first wagon in the column. It took off and went right to the Indians. The teamster was supposed to be manning it, was back watching them lower the wagons off this hill. And anyway, that wagon ran away. That had all the artillery ammunition in it, except for 18 rounds that were with the cannon. It also had half a load of blankets, wool blankets. It had most of the men's backpacks and extra equipment in it. So the Indians really made a great coup there. However, they never did capture the artillery piece. But they think that one of the Bits, from Bits Fort, was part of that attack, and he was going to show them how to use the artillery. And had they captured that gun, this fort would have been in a bad place. But I guess, you know, it's wagon box. They switched from muzzle-loading rifles, like the Civil War. Like Sonny said, when they came out here, all the weapons there, they were right out of the Civil War. The morning of the Fetterman fight, 98 soldiers volunteered to go out and relieve the wood train. Of them, 49 had unserviceable rifles. So they lost half their support right off the bat because their muskets weren't up to speed. And then, of course, the rest took their muskets into. But if our numbers of raw recruits that were with the fort out here and with Fetterman are as high as we think they are, most of them never got the training they needed to have to use their muskets properly. They didn't have the training they needed to fight properly. And they certainly had, what little training they may have got on military tactics did not fit the situation out here. You have the muskets, and in the manuals on the muskets, they say their range is like 2,000 yards. Well, that's if they're pointing a rifle this high in the air, and it's if 1,000 men in one block are shooting at 1,000 men in another block, and they're just kind of lobbing artillery only in musket form. That's the only way they could possibly be effective. They might reach out to 2,000 yards, but they're not going to be able to shoot at an individual that way. They were pretty good out to about 150 to 200 yards. But the Army had not caught up with the power of the weapons they had, and did not use tactics very well for them.
Yeah, the Army did not start marksmanship training until the 1880s as a result of the Little Bighorn and other disasters along the way there. But as Bob said, the muzzle-loading rifles, and they were meant for like volley fire, where you had groups of men shooting at groups of men. The Indians were not going to hold still long enough, and they sure weren't going to be exchanging volley fire with you. I don't think they're going to sit there and exchange bows and arrows with musket balls. So the troops like at Fetterman, the frustration, and they talk about when Fetterman was leading in, Fetterman was with the infantry up on the ridge up here, and then Grumman was with the cavalry, and the infantry was in skirmish line with the cavalry on their flanks. Well, they were doing it, and it was a perfect maneuver for a Civil War battlefield, but it was not the right maneuver for fighting against Indians. And when they got over there, probably the best account I've ever heard about what happens in things like the Fetterman battle and the Battle of Little Bighorn was this one modern-day colonel, how he stated, he said that Custer found himself in a target-rich environment with insufficient firepower. And that's essentially where Fetterman was up here too. You know, with the musket, and the men were not trained enough. I mean, they say a guy with a well-trained guy with a Civil War musket should be able to get off like 3 shots a minute. Well, first thing is, if you haven't been trained, if you haven't been firing that gun, you've been dry firing at best, or if you know, then they hadn't done much of the school of the infantrymen. They've been building a fort, so they're pretty skilled with an axe, but they're not that handy with their muskets. To where, if you imagine being out there, the Indians, their arrows are flying around, there are Indians coming at you, and if you were steady a hand, maybe you could take out a ramrod and load the muzzle loader that way. But your hand would probably be shaking, probably dropping cartridges. The guy beside you might have an arrow sticking out of him, he might be screaming, and you'd really take some nerves of steel if you could load 3 shots and fire into those conditions. A lot of them, they talk about, just kind of threw their guns down and gave up at the end. And the majority of casualties were bludgeoned to death at the Fetterman fight, which kind of says that it was close in action, probably not much resistance. But again, the techniques but these officers, they were trained in those Civil War techniques and those Civil War tactics, and they were not applicable out here. And people like Fetterman and Brown, and well, Fetterman especially came out here, and he's going to figure out how to fight the Indians. Well, he didn't figure it out very well. But anyway, I guess that's where the tie-in with the Civil War goes, is that the Civil War tactics are not very applicable here. And we would see that with the wagon box fight the next year, where they had breech-loading weapons, they were able to take cover behind wagon boxes and fight from behind cover. There's an entirely different result as far as against a large number of Indians. Some other things that tie in with the Civil War, well, just the names of these forts. Fort Connor, which is Connor had named for himself down on Powder River when he first built it in 1865, was renamed Fort Reno, and it was named for Major General Jesse Reno. He was killed at the Battle of South Mountain right before Antietam in Virginia, or Maryland, I'm sorry, in Maryland in 1862. So all these forts out here were named many times for Civil War generals that had been killed. So Reno was named for Jesse Reno. Fort Phil Kearney, which the proper name is Fort Philip Kearney, and that's the way it was supposed to be addressed, as Philip Kearney, not Phil Kearney. We kind of made it a little bit informal. But General Philip Kearney had been killed in the Civil War at the Battle of Chantilly right before Antietam in August of 1862. He was quite a character. He was a West Point graduate. It's called Kearney the Magnificent. And he had one arm. He lost an arm in the Mexican War. He charging, got shot, and lost an arm in the Mexican War. After he lost his arm in the Mexican War, he went to Africa and fought in the French, was kind of the equivalent of the French Foreign Legion in Africa. He also, his uncle was Stephen Kearney, that Kearney, Nebraska is named for. And Stephen Kearney was a colonel of cavalry during the Mexican War that eventually took a group of cavalry, went down, took New Mexico, took it present day Arizona, and then went out to California and finished up into conquering California for the Americans during the Mexican War in the 1840s. Kearney was also a millionaire. His family was very wealthy, and there's Kearney, New Jersey. There's a Kearney, New Jersey, and but anyway, so he really didn't have to be out here. He really didn't have to be in warfare doing that. He loved the combat. If he hadn't been killed, I think he probably would have been the next commander of the Army of the Potomac instead of George McClellan at the Battle of Antietam. And who knows, it might have turned out different that way. Because he was, unfortunately, at the Battle of Chantilly, he went too far forward of his division. He's called out by Confederate pickets. He turned and tried to ride away Indian style, and they shot him in the rear end and killed him. But anyway, both the southern generals and the northern generals all felt bad because Kearney was such a great guy. Well, anyway, that's who this fort was named for, was General Philip Kearney, not Phil Kearney.
And then Fort C.F. Smith, that up here to the north of us, was also named for a Civil War general, C.F. Smith. I think he died of blood poisoning or some darn thing, I don't know.
Yeah, stubbed his toe on a nail getting off the ship at Shiloh.
Okay, well, so anyway, but anyway, so that's it. So these forts are, again, that Civil War tie-in of just the very names of these forts through here. Most of the officers, after Carrington left in January of 1866, he wasn't kicked out because of the Fetterman battle. He was scheduled to go anyway. I'd like to emphasize that he was scheduled to go rotate down and take command of that 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry, so the 18th Infantry. But because of the Spain, supposedly the Fetterman fight, they always tried to put it off that he was removed because of the Fetterman fight. And he was not removed because of the Fetterman fight. He was scheduled to go anyway. But all the officers who came in after that were also Civil War officers. John E. Smith, Henry Wessels, two of the people that commanded here. And then most of the junior captains, lieutenants, or anything. Everybody were usually Civil War officers from some time back. So that Civil War influence was very tight. And a number of the civilians. For instance, at the Battle of the Hayfield on August 1st of 1867, up by Fort C.F. Smith, the lieutenant who was in command, he got killed, and a former Confederate captain took over command of the defenses there. And there were also a mixture of former Confederate and military troops in the civilian populations all through here, that did have. So that Civil War influence out in this area was very prominent and would continue to be prominent for many years. Much as, like after World War II, it's hard to find somebody that hadn't been in the military after World War II, and that's the way it was with very often the Civil War at that time. But that just kind of, I guess, basically, let's see if I can finally look at my notes here to see, as far as our tie-ins of Fort Kearney in the Civil War. I think that basically that's about all I had to say. Bob, do you have anything to add?
No. I guess on the figures back there, if you go to look at stuff, most of them are set up with their weapons, an example of the ammunition they fire, some of their extra weapons that they might be carrying, along with eating utensils and kind of an example of what their diet might have been. So have a look around, but yeah, be careful about touching them or anything because they're pretty wobbly. They got a room full of drunken soldiers.
They are the tallest.
Probably appropriate.
They are the tallest Chinese soldiers you'll ever see. Any questions from any of you, or anything you want to discuss with us? Anything to say? Yes, no, what?
I got a question. Sonny.
Yes.
What is the proper spelling of not only General Kearney, but also Fortville Kearney?
The proper spelling is NY.
NY.
And it's one of those situations. Now there also is in the Irish slang, there is an NEY. But for the Kearney family, and I know because I looked at their genealogy book, and they spelled it NY. But you get Army, it's much like, well, let's talk about Casper Collins. Casper Collins was C-A-S-P-A-R. And so now it's the town of Casper, C-A-S-P-E-R, all that, and in Fort Casper. Some Army clerk somewhere misspelled his name, and it stuck. And the Kearney with the EY that we had, that, and people weren't that picky about spelling back then. If you knew his name was Kearney and you could spell out some version of Kearney, that was probably pretty good at that stage in the game. But the spelling of the EY up here, NEY, and the spelling of the Casper with the E instead of the A down there at Casper, those are probably some type of military clerk that probably wasn't a very good clerk, but he had the power to put down what's on paper for it.
But when it comes to the fort, wasn't the original official document with the EY?
Well, it was depending on the clerk that wrote it, but the NY was the correct spelling. But then they didn't care. They interchanged them. You know what they had?
if I, one officer would spell it E-Y, another officer would spell it N-Y. And, but the official genuine spelling is the N-Y. That I can guarantee you, but I can't guarantee you that whoever wrote it down really cared what they said. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned that a well-trained soldier could get off 3 rounds a minute with a muzzle rifle. Do you happen to know what range they trained at?
Range?
Yeah, what distance are they shooting there?
Listen, less than 200 yards. Like Bob was saying, they said that those guns could shoot up to 2,000 yards. I think the radiated sights on them goes up to 1,200. But you're, at that stage, you're launching it like a mortar. But for just straight on flat shooting, preferably 100 or less, but I would say 200 maximum.
They're also, at 3 rounds a minute, they're starting with a loaded rifle.
Yeah.
So it takes about 30 seconds to load your rifle.
Unless I'm doing it, then it's about 3 minutes.
But
Yeah.
Bob, would they have been, for instance, would they have marched to the Fetterman Battle Ridge with the weapon already loaded?
Yes. And they had range markers around the fort for the riflemen on the stockade. They had a marker at 100 yards and another one at 200. They had little flags, so a red one and a blue one. So that if somebody was attacking the fort, like a castle or something, the men would know we could change the sights on the rifles or adjust them if they even thought about it.
But as Bob was saying, that these guys hadn't had a lot of fire experience. Carrington was always complaining about his short ammunition. I don't think he's that short ammunition. I know Fed, but they were doing School of the Soldier, but that was on the parade ground. Probably practicing dry firing, practicing maneuvers, probably bayonet practice, which is a lot of good, And but I think it really wasn't again until the 1880s that the Army actually started to try to make marksmen out of their soldiers. Yes.
I've got a question for Bob. I just wonder where you got the uniforms that you've got back there. Are they authentic reproductions or what?
Walmart, wasn't it?
Vietnam, World War II, they're mostly original. And even some of the Spanish American. But other ones, there's, people, I had people make them for me.
Oh, okay.
A lot of the accoutrements are original, more so than uniforms actually. But just looking for them.
Well, you sure have a nice collection of them. I was enjoying looking at them, yeah.
Thank you.
Now this is the tip of the iceberg here.
We have about 54 uniforms.
Oh my goodness, wow.
He's done a lot of internet time, and there's a lot of wealthy tailors over in Europe.
Well, the one I found is really reasonable, real reasonable.
Do you know of any other collection of that magnitude in the country?
I've seen a couple of photographs of a like collection of American troops, but I think that was military. I think that was done through the military. It was a promotional thing. But I don't know of any individual for sure. I've heard of a couple of people that have uniform collections, but I'm not sure what they're considered uniform collections or what's involved in their collection.
But certainly nothing that your average citizen can view.
No. That was the reason. I just wanted something when I'm pushing up roses that, that people can see their history. I didn't think that, not everybody can afford to go back to Washington, D.C. or the Smithsonian. So that's where I was coming from.
Yeah.
And it just started. I was doing living history and just got more interested in the uniform.
Well, it's pretty amazing what he has, and I don't know what Patty's going to do with everything. What do you go for?
I take them out for target practice.
Well, you've got about, like I say, a Philippine one there. I mean, heck, you know, they'd probably like to have that over there in Manila.
Yeah, good point, they probably don't have anything like
But,
that.
yeah, but,
It does matter for American, for American.
yeah, but,
Nowadays,
Yeah.
but, you know, but it's an amazing collection he has, and you know, and for Veterans Day, you know, he decided to put these out, so and as he's mentioned, you know, these are civil wars that the Americans, you know, fought. You know, like the Filipino War against us was, but it was a civil war. The Filipinos were fighting against us for their freedom in a way. You know, and then of course our Revolutionary War. And then the Korean War, which, you know, two sides of Korea fighting against each other. Vietnam, two sides of Vietnam fighting against each other. You know, so, you know, and it wouldn't have taken much in 1861, 1880, up until 1863, 64, we could have very easily had the British or the French in here supporting the Confederacy. With one mistake, you know, the British had brought a bunch of troops into Canada after we captured, or after the United States captured some southern diplomats off of a British ship.
yes.
And so when we just about went to a shooting, and there were people that were wanting to go to war with Britain one more time. It was shown this time. Well, Lincoln said, hey, let's one dog fight at a time here. We don't need to, but Lincoln put an end to that. And God, he was a brilliant man. He said, no, we don't need to be fighting the British. And by 1860, 1864, the British, for one thing, the British public were opposed to slavery. And so they kind of put the kibosh on the British. Their public opinion was against the British going in. And once you took away, you know, the British also started to import cotton from Egypt, and they didn't need the southern cotton that much anymore. And so suddenly the South kind of left high and dry there. And but it's touch and go. You know, survival in the United States is never a guaranteed thing.
Even today.
Even today, you know.
today.
But we had to laugh, the old German Chancellor Bismarck, and somebody asked him about something after the Spanish-American War about the United States as a world power, and he said, God smiles on fools in the United States of America. And we kicked the heck out of Spain. But I don't know, again, we'll get into much more of that ancient politics. We definitely don't want to get into any modern politics. So any other questions on anything? Oh, yes.
The Civil War officers that came here and worked at these forts, were they Confederate or Union, or did it matter by the government who they sent out?
Oh, they were Union. During the 1860s, we had not got into reconciliation between the South and the North, and there weren't. It wouldn't be until the 1880s and really about the Spanish-American War when we would see things like Joseph Wheeler, who had been a major general in the Confederate cavalry commanding troops in Cuba, things like that. But it wouldn't be until the late 1870s before you started to see the Southern recruits going into cadets going into West Point again. Basically, through the 1860s, they were traitors. And if they'd been Southern troops, I mean, they might get along with them, but they had lost. A lot of people figured they'd forfeited their rights, and definitely their military rights when they sided with the Confederacy. Especially if they'd already taken a commission and had sworn allegiance to the United States. That's where things got really ouchy as far as individual went.
Wasn't Lieutenant Gatewood, wasn't he Confederate?
I don't know. The Apache deal, Arizona, Gatewood, down there.
Yeah, well, and then he
Geronimo?
served over here at
Oh,
the beginning, at the end of his
Well, he
career.
might have been from the South, but that would have been the 1880s, and by then I think things had scabbed over enough.
Yeah.
I think he went through like West Point in the 70s sometime, something like
Yeah, I
that.
think you're right.
Yeah, but at the time of 1866 to 1868 out here, they were very, it was very ouchy about, I mean, there were Southerners here and on the frontier, people got along and did what they had to do, but they weren't giving out commissions to Southern officers in 1866, former Southern officers in any way.
Yeah, we'll take their privates, but don't give us any officers.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, but if you had sworn allegiance to the, especially the ones that had been to West Point, or in the Army before the Civil War, and if you had sworn allegiance to the United States and then resigned and joined the Confederacy, well, you know, there was still a debate until well into that summer and fall 1865 whether they were going to hang Abraham, or going to hang Robert E. Lee and Jeff Davis. So, you know, so yeah, so it was a.
Now, didn't those galvanized Yankees, they call them, didn't they have to take an oath
Yes,
to
they
the
did.
U.S. before
Yes, they
could
did.
serve here?
Yeah, the guarantee was that they wouldn't have to fight against their brother Confederates.
Right,
You
if
go
they
out-
had to take an oath to
Yeah,
the
yeah, they had to take an oath to the Union.
Yeah.
You know, and then they did muster them out pretty fast. And I think they signed up for like 3 years, and then by that fall 1865, they were pretty well mustered them out, and you know, because they're you know, dismantling volunteer regiments, and they didn't want to pay them anything. Then they could have stayed in the regular army as an enlisted man or a non-com, you know. I doubt if they would have made officer grade, but they could have, you know, but they could have served in the, because they'd already, you know, they'd sworn to the United States, and they, you know, they already had the uniform. What the heck? You know.
Say, Bob, can you explain what would make an unserviceable weapon?
Too rusty.
Say,
Too rusty.
too rusty?
I think, you know,
Rust.
these weapons are pretty forgiving in a way, but,
Spring
I
would go
would think
bad.
the action's not working right or something, or like I said, too rusty, not clean. Could very well be broken, you know,
Yeah.
mainspring could have been broken.
Hammer might not go back, come down. Yeah,
They didn't, all they said was that unserviceable weapons. They didn't really describe what this.
If there's ever another big archaeological dig up here, the place to do it would be right, I'll tell everybody to go up there at midnight and do it, I guess. Would be right down on the other side of that fence to the east of the fence by the bathrooms and everything. There's a really good, and that's where things turned up. When they redid that road, the county road there, they cut right in, and that's when Galloway, they cut right into this dump, major dump.
Yeah, right there where the county road goes,
Right.
the Ford's dump.
Well, when you were putting the bathrooms or the stone restrooms in there, they
Yeah.
cut that trench. We looked at it there, and that was
Yeah,
in
that
that
was
dump.
it, yeah. And where that irrigation ditch was there, stuff come out. But I found a memo from summer 1867 saying, because they'd just been throwing, guys were just throwing stuff over the walls. And his memo is, you won't be throwing your trash over the walls. All trash will be deposited in a ravine 100 yards to the northeast of the stockade line. And that would be right in that area. So Elsie Spear Byron, the deer deteriorated so fast we couldn't save him. But she had some copies of burnt papers that had been in there that had Fort Phil Kearney discharge on them. Unfortunately, they were just deteriorated. And there might have, in there, and Bob and I have been out there just walking along, you pick up a button, you pick up all kinds
Oh,
of
yeah,
stuff.
you can see, you run across up there.
But if they were just wanting to excavate cultural artifacts, you could go out there and probably, God knows, find, because, you know, Galloway had combs, hair combs, pocket knives.
Pipe with a flower painted on it, an enamel pipe with a flower. I really wonder who would have owned that one. Yeah. It's real pretty, I mean, really beautiful.
I don't know, but I don't think it's Mrs. Carrington's.
Probably not.
I don't know if it was a woman or a guy.
No.
It's like, you know, a clay pipe like this one had a
Very. But anyway, that would be the place if you're just if you're wanting to go in and check out the massive cultural remains of what was that Fort McCarty. And I know they threw broken muskets in there, probably lots of broken parts.
Well, as I understand it, they were supposed to return any unserviceable weapons to the quartermaster. He would send them to the appropriate
An armor.
armory or
Yeah.
out here for
That's
that.
true.
And in fact, there's one account of Lieutenant, Captain Booster Bradley, I guess it was, up at Fort Smith. They, after they got their 1866 gallon conversion, and he had like an artery of 150 muzzle loaders, 1864 or whatever, 68 muzzle loaders, and he wanted to give them to the crows.
Yeah.
So we have no use for them. You know, we've got our brand new weapons. These are, you know, why were you packing these around? Let's give them the crows some ammunition and let them go and shoot super. But anyway, but yeah, but so, and there's something, now the only thing they probably kept that would be very valuable, of course, would be if they broke like, you know, the cannon situation, I think they would have kept the two of the guns if the carry broke. And with weaponry though, unless they probably had a bone pile of the ones that they used to fix the gun, muskets. But once they got the gallon conversions, outside of bands, outside of that stuff, none of the actives or anything, they were pretty worthless.
The other thing I haven't figured out why Shirley's been in this battle hasn't been very hard. They may just been issued, you know, the person's life. I mean, it was really nice. The way that battle, they're not hard. Like the crazy one.
Well, yeah, but those are recruits, and they're, you know, supposedly, you know, but yeah, no way they're recruits.
Sure.
That's a good question, Paul. I don't know. I don't know why they were.
Are the Teamsters, what? Teamsters, they were military.
Yeah, well, yeah, but the crazy one battle on July 2nd, 1866, that first one. And Lieutenant Mons, he had a Henry rifle, another officer. Like 15 enlisted men had muzzle loaded weaponry. But the others, like 16 soldiers, didn't have guns, and none of the Teamsters had guns. And I don't know why you'd be caught out here without it.
Well, in Carrington, I can't remember, was it, yeah, late 66, I think it was, wasn't he issuing surplus weapons to the Teamsters?
Yeah, but he was, in fact, there's accounts of wagon trains that came up here, but there'd be like 30 guys in a wagon train, and 10 of them would have weapons, and they had like 200 rounds of ammunition. And these guys are not all armed to the teeth. I'm reminded of the battle in New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, 500 Kentuckians showed up, and none of them had guns. And Andrew Jackson said, my God, I've never seen a Kentuckian without a bottle of whiskey, a deck of playing cards, and a gun. These guys, you know. So, you know, but yeah, there's guys out here on the frontier that, you know, we think everybody walking around well-heeled. I'd have 2 or 3 guns, but there were always situations like these wagon trains and stuff where there might be like 2 pistols and a whole train of guys. Anyway, I guess how dirty you were. Or broke, yeah. Any other questions from anyone? Thoughts? Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Do you know if the bayonet was used in the Fetterman battle? I mean,
Well, we found one, you guys found one.
well, yeah, but we don't know when that was dropped or who dropped it.
Well, they had them.
But I was curious
It's
to
quite a
know.
ways down off there.
What's that?
It was down by the road.
So,
It was down by the corner of the fence by the road.
yeah, by the road. So it wasn't on the ridge. I was always curious because technically, wouldn't Fetterman would have ordered bayonets when it was such in close
Well, most of the
fight?
fight was on foot and fairly close, and I assume they had, I wouldn't imagine going out without bayonets.
I'm sure they had.
There's no indication that they didn't.
No, but whether they, but I don't,
Whether they
I'm
got
not-
to use them.
yeah, now whether they lined up like the movie Zulu or something, where, you know, ready to go. But they also had 27 sabers at each of the cavalry. That didn't do them much good either.
Yeah, that was an ornament.
Yeah, they lost 27 carbines, Spencer's, 27 sabers, and 9 pistols.
Yeah.
is what the cavalry lost were as far as weaponry goes.
Yeah, and I haven't seen them tally as far as, bayonets being lost.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure, well, I'm sure they had it, but by the time, and they were not trained for I mean, they probably done some poke and practice, but I mean, when you got those Indians coming at you, the Indians talked about a lot of those guys just broke down, you know. I mean, it takes some real nerve to put on your bayonet and be ready to put on a little parry and thrust.
Yeah, they would probably need to be gotten that order while they're still on top of the hill before you get close.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if because it was part of the tactics of the military taxes, I just would wonder if they were ordered to fix bayonets while they were still on the ridge.
You got 3 Indians with clubs flying in on you, and you got your bayonet.
Well, I meant on the Life Trail Ridge.
Yeah, they might have.
Yeah.
I don't know. Now, I don't know how trained they were to load them with that bayonet on. That would be a little tricky.
Yeah, because I think the 3-minute thing would go right up the window then.
Yeah, you can stick it yourself.
Yeah. But you've never seen any Indian accounts? And I
No
have.
bayonets? No. The only bayonet I know is Crazy Horse. So.
Really the only is for what you found.
Yeah, that's the only indication that I've ever seen of that. And we don't know if that could have been post or pre-battle.
That could have been from Crook's Column, that could have been from anywhere along the Bozeman Trail.
Right.
Or some guy just said, I'm tired of packing this thing.
Yeah, context-wise, there was no context.
Yeah, or he might have broke, scabbard might have broke. Or an Indian might have had it.
That was my theory all along, but
One of the great artifacts, like the Sheridan County Historical has, is a rapier blade from about the 1500s.
Yeah.
Toledo steel. It's got markings of Toledo steel. And it was probably used as a lance blade. But a lot of people use that as reasons the Spanish were up here because they found this rapier blade. I think probably somebody traded it to some Comanches or something. But anyway, it was up there, found in the field out by Dave. So let me prove the Spanish were here. Any other questions? Anybody wants to join Bob back at the uniforms? He can talk to you about the uniforms.
Sonny and Bob, thank you much.